The Saturday morning light was coming through the garage door, hitting a half-finished wooden cabinet sitting on my workbench. I remember the sound of the saw cutting to the last board, the smell of fresh sawdust in the air, and that feeling when you think you are finally close to finishing something you've been working on for days. Then I placed the pieces together. The measurements were off. The holes didn't line up. The lumber I carefully selected suddenly felt like wasted money sitting in front of me. And I was standing there, looking at another project that should have worked, but didn't. That moment is something almost every woodworker knows. You spend your time, your money, and your effort, and somehow the project still falls apart before the finish line. But what if the problem was never your woodworking ability? What if the real issue started before you ever touched a piece of wood? Because there is one part of woodworking that most people underestimate, and it can determine whether a project succeeds or becomes another unfinished build taking up space in the garage. Most people in this situation assume the problem is their skill level. They think they need better tools, more experience, more practice. Maybe they simply are not good enough yet. But after looking deeper into how many hobby woodworkers approach their projects, I started noticing a different pattern. The problem often begins with the information they are using before construction even starts. The real enemy is what I call the incomplete plan problem. Because a woodworking plan is supposed to remove uncertainty, it should answer the important questions before the first cut is made. What size should each piece be? How much material is actually needed? What order should everything be assembled? Which details matter before mistakes become expensive? But many plans people find online focus heavily on the final image and very little on the actual building process. They show what the finished project looks like, but they leave the builder trying to figure out how to get there. And that gap creates a problem that affects beginners and experienced woodworkers alike. Ted McGrath built his woodworking education around solving this exact issue. With more than 25 years of experience, he developed woodworking resources based on the idea that successful projects require clear instructions, accurate measurements, and practical guidance, not just attractive pictures of finished builds. The difference seems small, but in woodworking, small details create big consequences. Think about the first situation. You find a project online that looks perfect. Maybe it is a piece of furniture you have wanted to build for your home. The design looks professional. The finished photos look impressive. So you gather your materials. You spend money on lumber. You clear space in your workshop. You start cutting. And then you reach a point where the instructions become unclear. A measurement is missing. A step assumes you already know something. A diagram does not explain how two pieces connect. Now you are forced to stop and figure out yourself. And this is where many people make a mistake that costs them far more than they realize. They start improvising. Sometimes improvisation works, but sometimes a small adjustment creates a bigger problem later in the build. A cabinet door sits uneven. A joint does not line up correctly. A piece that looked right at the beginning becomes impossible to finish cleanly. The project slows down. The excitement disappears. And eventually, many woodworkers start thinking, maybe I'm just not experienced enough. But the issue was not always a builder. Sometimes the instructions were never complete enough to guide the process. Now consider a second scenario. You are someone who enjoys woodworking on weekends. You have a garage workshop. You have some tools. You have the motivation. But every new project starts the same way. Searching, comparing, downloading another plan, saving another file, trying to determine whether the information is actually useful. What nobody tells you about woodworking is that finding projects can become almost as frustrating as building them. You can spend hours looking for the right design, only to discover later that the plan does not include everything you need. Then you repeat the process. Another search, another purchase, another set of instructions to evaluate. Over time, the cost is not only financial, it is the lost momentum. The weekend you plan to build becomes another weekend spent preparing. And slowly, the hobby becomes less about creating and more about trying to organize information. The third situation is where the financial cost becomes easier to see. Imagine starting a project with expensive lumber. You carefully choose your boards because you do not want to waste material. You measure twice. You cut once. But halfway through, you discover that the plan did not account for a detail you needed. Now you have a problem. The wood has already been cut. The mistake cannot simply disappear. You may need additional materials. You may need to redesign part of the project. And even if you solve it, there is that frustrating feeling every woodworker recognizes. I should have known this before I started. The part that surprised me most about this problem is that many people blame themselves after these situations. They assume they made a mistake because they are beginners. But experienced builders face the same challenge when the information behind a project is incomplete. And here's what all three of these situations have in common. They are not really tool problems. They are not always skill problems. They are information problems. The foundation of every woodworking project is the plan. If the foundation is unclear, everything built on top of it becomes harder. After seeing this pattern repeatedly, I started asking a different question. Instead of asking, how do I become better at fixing mistakes? I started asking, what if I could reduce the mistakes before they happen? That changed the entire approach. The solution was not simply finding more projects. It was finding a more complete system for planning those projects. A resource where the focus was not only the finished result, but the actual process of getting there. That is where a structured woodworking library becomes valuable. Instead of collecting random individual plans from different places, the approach is to have a centralized collection of projects with detailed instructions, measurements, and organized information. Now think back to those three problems. The first issue was unclear instructions. A detailed plan changes that by giving the builder a clearer path for materials to finish project. The second issue was wasting time searching for projects. A large organized library changes that by putting many different woodworking ideas in one place instead of forcing you to start from zero every time. The third issue was wasting materials. Better preparation helps reduce unnecessary mistakes because you understand the project before making the first cut. This is the principle behind what Ted McGrath created with Ted's Woodworking. Instead of treating woodworking plans as simple drawings, the focus is on providing a complete reference system. The library includes thousands of woodworking plans covering different types of projects, created with input from experienced craftsmen and draftsmen. A realistic example would be a hobby woodworker who has limited time after work. Instead of spending several evenings searching for a suitable project and trying to piece together incomplete information, they can begin with a structured plan and spend that time actually building. The difference is not that the project suddenly becomes effortless. Woodworking still requires patience, attention, and practice. The difference is removing unnecessary uncertainty. Now, one objection usually comes up. I don't have a professional workshop. And that is understandable. Many people imagine woodworking requires a large space filled with expensive equipment. But many hobby woodworkers begin with something much simpler. A garage, a small workspace, a collection of basic tools built over time. The important part is not having the biggest workshop. It is having reliable information before you begin. One woodworker might use detailed plans to organize a weekend furniture project in a small garage and avoid wasting materials by preparing everything beforehand. Another might use a larger collection of plans simply as a way to explore different projects and develop new skills over time. The situations are different, but the principle remains the same. Clear information creates better decisions, and better decisions create better builds. That is why a complete woodworking resource can be useful, not because it replaces experience, but because it supports the experience you are already developing. The reason this approach works is simple. Good woodworking starts before the first cut is made. The interesting thing about woodworking is that most unfinished projects do not begin with a lack of motivation. They begin with small obstacles, a missing measurement, an unclear step, a plan that looks complete until you actually try to build from it. 6 months from now, the same problems can continue repeating. More saved projects, more unfinished builds, more time spent searching instead of creating. Or the process can look different. You can approach each project with a clearer understanding of what needs to happen, what materials are required, and what steps come next. Not every project will be perfect. Mistakes are part of learning. But there's a difference between learning from woodworking challenges and struggling because the information was incomplete from the beginning. You have already been doing the hard part. You are investing your time, your effort, and your curiosity. The plans simply need to keep up with that commitment. Most failed woodworking projects are not evidence that someone cannot build. They are evidence that building something meaningful requires the right preparation. The next step is not about having more motivation. It is about having better information before you begin. If you want to see what I use for organizing my woodworking projects, I left a link in the description. If this video helped you look at woodworking plans differently, consider subscribing and share your experience in the comments. What is the biggest challenge you have faced when trying to complete a woodworking project?